It's been 6 months since the Global Climate Summit COP26 ended with tears and regret. Climate Conference President Alok Sharma broke down as he apologized for last-minute changes to the wording about coal, from phasing out to phasing down. It's a big deal. Coal is the dirtiest of fossil fuels. It is the most responsible for global warming and the biggest threat to the 2015 Paris climate goals, including limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That subtle change in wording is something vulnerable nations want richer nations to know is life-threatening.
For those who have eyes to see, for those who have ears to listen, and for those who have a heart to feel, 1.5 is what we need to survive. 2 degrees, yes, SG, is a death sentence.
Are strong words to actively fight against global warming. COP26 was structured around 4 main objectives. 1, reach carbon neutrality by 2050 and keep global warming to below an increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And number 2, to adapt to protect communities and natural habitats, particularly those most threatened by climate change. And 3, mobilize climate finance to at least $100 billion a year to achieve the first 2 goals. And 4, work together to achieve carbon neutrality. Fortunately or unfortunately, the countries that are the biggest contributors to the problem also have the greatest power to make it right. China is by far the world's biggest emitter of CO2, with about 58% of the total energy generated by China in 2019 coming from coal alone. The US is second, but with CO2 emissions per capita almost double that of China's. India, Russia and Japan round out the world's top 5 emitters list. Dawn Tan has been looking at the 2 main strategies to combat climate change.
Here are the 2 main strategies to combat climate change. The first is mitigation. This can be done in several ways. For example, stopping deforestation and regenerating nature through reforestation, or by using technology for carbon capture. This means that any CO2 produced from industry and power generation isn't allowed to escape into the atmosphere. Another way is by ditching fossil fuels altogether and using renewable sources for energy production, such as wind and solar. The same applies for transportation. For this, wide adoption of electric vehicles that don't emit CO2 would be needed. Even existing buildings can be improved by retrofitting them with green technology and practices. We can make them more energy efficient and reduce their CO2 footprint. For those things that we can't mitigate for, well, we will just have to find ways to adapt. For rising sea levels, low-lying areas will have to build up those seawalls, elevate their infrastructure, or in some cases, just relocate. In areas where water is scarce, reducing and reusing this vital resource, well, that is going to be key. Connected to water availability, we may have to change the type of things that we grow and just where we grow them. This would include urban farming in large buildings and at a smaller scale in our own homes. Now, lastly, protecting the world's carbon sinks by proactively using prescribed burning to prevent uncontrollable wildfires.
And to help us understand what we're up against, we're joined by Professor Jan Minx. He's head of applied sustainability science at the Mercator Research Institute in Berlin. He's also a coordinating lead author of IPCC's April report, which focuses on what needs to be done to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Professor Minx, let's get straight to that report. You commented on it. You said the age of fossil fuels must end. That means coal, oil, gas must stay in the ground, and all investment in this kind of fossil fuel must be abandoned. How likely is this ever to happen?
Good evening. The report indeed is very clear. So we have been now growing emissions for the last 270 years, and we have about 30 to 50 years left to reach net zero emissions. So this is really a steep ask, and we all have to work together to achieve that. One thing that hundreds of model simulations are very clear about, what we need to do first is to move out of coal, and this very quickly. So we really need to organize a global coal exit already by 2030. And regardless whether or not we are in a 1.5 or in a 2-degree world, we need substantial progress in reducing coal consumption. So that's a key aspect.
Professor Minx, if I may cut in right here. Now, what happened at COP26? You saw China and India stepping in to force the watering down of the wording from phasing out coal use to phasing down coal use. You're looking at 95% reduction by 2050 of just coal. Given that what we saw in COP26, this is not going to happen.
At the IPCC approval plenary, also all the countries are there, and they agreed to language that is very clear that it is not possible to build, for example, new coal power plants unless they are equipped with carbon capture and storage. We also need to further to earlier retire our existing coal power plants, and we also need to work on utilizing them not as intensely as we have done in the past. And this has all been accepted by the governments of the world. So I think now it's the time to organize that.
All right, moving on. Apart from cutting our use of fossil fuels, the other tactic or strategy proposed is carbon capture. So whether it's natural, so we reforestation as an example, or we come up with better technologies to absorb carbon from the atmosphere. The IPCC has acknowledged that there are significant barriers to achieving this on a large enough scale to be effective. How would you see the place of carbon capture in us reaching our goal of not exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius?
The IPCC is very clear that we have to reduce emissions very rapidly, but a complementary strategy is, and it's also a necessary component of achieving the Paris climate goals, is to also remove CO2 from the atmosphere, so to capture it, as you say. For the first time, the report is very clear that this has to be done. So in very simple words, net zero means that there is something that we need to compensate, but that is on top of very aggressive and rapid emission reductions.
So are you at all nervous or afraid that by recommending carbon capture, the impetus to cut energy use is lost?
This is a matter of policy design, I would say, as long as you have, for example, different targets, so one for reducing emissions and one for removing carbon, I think that can be dealt with very efficiently. So I'm not very nervous about this. This is all about policy design, and it can be done.
Oh, thanks very much for all that, Professor Jan Minx speaking to us. He's head of the Applied Sustainability Science in Mercator Research Institute in Berlin. Thanks for that.